My name is Olivia Bennett, and until 4 years ago, I never thought I'd have to compete for my husband's mislove with another woman, let alone his mother. I met David Maxwell at my college roommate's wedding, where he was the best man and I was the maid of honor. We locked eyes across the dance floor, and within minutes, he'd asked me to dance. He was charming, successful, and seemed genuinely interested in my work as a graphic designer. When he asked for my number that night, I had no idea I was signing up for the most challenging relationship of my life. The first time I met Eleanor Maxwell, David's mother, she greeted me with a warm smile and a tight hug that felt just a little too rehearsed. "David has told me so much about you," she said, her eyes scanning my features, lingering a bit too long on my brown skin, the result of my black father and white mother. Still, I was determined to make a good impression. That first dinner at her immaculate colonial home seemed to go well, though I noticed how she subtly examined my hands when I passed her the salt, how she asked probing questions about my interesting background, and how she repeatedly mentioned David's ex-girlfriend Stephanie, who apparently came from one of the best families in Connecticut. When David proposed 6 months later, I was overjoyed. And though Eleanor's congratulations seemed strained, I chalked it up to the normal adjustment of a mother seeing her only son commit to someone else. On our wedding day, I overheard her whisper to David, "You can still back out, you know?" But when I confronted him later, he insisted I'd misheard. After the wedding, we found a beautiful colonial house just 15 minutes from downtown. Because my credit score was better, we put the deed solely in my name, planning to add David after he cleared up some old debt. When Eleanor came to see the house, she nodded approvingly at the crown molding and hardwood floors, but referred to our purchase as a temporary arrangement with a knowing smile at her son. I remember feeling a chill despite the summer heat that day. Over the following months, David's reassurances that his mother was just old-fashioned and needed time to adjust began to ring hollow, as her subtle jabs became more frequent and her interference more brazen. I never imagined that house would become the battlefield for my marriage as survival, or that one day I'd be helping my husband pack his bags to leave it. Not because I wanted him gone, but because he couldn't choose between his wife and his mother, and I could no longer pretend that was a choice any husband should have to make. The first year of our marriage was mostly blissful. David and I spent weekends stripping old wallpaper, painting rooms in colors we both loved, and making that beautiful colonial house our home. We hosted dinner parties for friends, planted a small garden in the backyard, and talked about which bedroom would make the perfect nursery someday. But like a shadow that gradually lengthens as the sun sets, Eleanor's presence in our marriage grew more pronounced and problematic. It started with the Sunday dinners at her house, a tradition David insisted we continue after the wedding. At first, I didn't mind. The food was good, and I genuinely wanted to build a relationship with my mother-in-law. But those dinners became increasingly uncomfortable as Eleanor used them to subtly interrogate me about my family. "And where exactly is your father's family from originally?" she'd ask with a smile that never reached her eyes. "What an unusual blend of features you have, dear. I can hardly tell what you are." When I expressed my discomfort to David during the drive home, he'd sigh and say, "Mom just wants to know you better, that's all. She's curious about your background because it's different from ours." Then he'd add, "She's from a different generation. Liv, please try to understand." I tried. God knows I tried. But understanding became harder when Eleanor accidentally referred to me as the help at a family reunion. I was bringing out a tray of appetizers when I overheard her telling Davidson, "The help has arrived with the hors d'oeuvres," only to quickly correct herself with a tinkling laugh when she saw my frozen expression. I mean, Olivia, silly me. David witnessed the whole thing, but later told me I was being too sensitive when I brought it up. The real eye-opener came when I discovered a framed family tree in Eleanor's study while looking for a bathroom during another Sunday dinner. The elaborate document traced the Maxwell family back to the Mayflower, with little notations about pure bloodlines and distinguished heritage scattered throughout. My stomach nodded as I noticed how many branches ended with red lines through names that sounded Italian, Irish, or Jewish, while others continued with proud, straight lines. I didn't need a historian to decode the implications. Meanwhile, Eleanor's calls to David increased in frequency and duration. She'd call him during our dinner, during movies, even during credit moments, and David always answered, stepping away with an apologetic shrug. It could be an emergency, he'd say, though it never was. Our first major argument erupted when we came home from a weekend getaway to find that Eleanor had redecorated our guest room with family heirlooms and antique furniture. Surprise! She'd exclaimed when we walked in, showing off the heavy mahogany bed and ancestral portraits she'd installed without permission. This room needed a touch of family history. When I later expressed to David that I felt violated, that this was our home, not a Maxwell museum, he became defensive. She was trying to do something nice, he insisted, though he promised it wouldn't happen again. That became a pattern. Eleanor would overstep. I would object. David would defend her initially, but promise change. And nothing would actually change. The comments about future grandchildren began around our first anniversary. When you have my grandchildren, Eleanor would say, looking pointedly at me, hopefully they'll look like Davy. Those Maxwell genes are strong, thank goodness. I smiled tightly and changed the subject while silently wondering if David noticed how these comments tore at the fabric of our marriage, thread by subtle thread. He seemed oblivious, caught in a lifetime pattern of placating his mother while promising me things would improve. But they didn't improve. They got worse. The boundary violations accelerated after our first anniversary. It started when I came home early from work one day to find Eleanor in our bedroom rifling through my jewelry box. We'd given her a spare key for emergencies only, but apparently she considered random home inspections within her rights. "Oh, Olivia," she exclaimed, not nearly startled enough when I appeared in the doorway. "I was just admiring your collection. Nothing very heirloom quality, is there? Perhaps someday you'll have something worthwhile to pass down." When I told David that evening, his response was lukewarm at best. "Mom appreciates fine things," he explained. She probably meant it as a compliment in her way. But the unannounced visits continued. Soon, I began finding evidence of Eleanor's presence, even when I hadn't caught her in the act. My clothes rearranged in the closet, kitchen cabinets reorganized, family photos subtly shifted to minimize my presence. The situation escalated dramatically when Eleanor began bringing potential alternate girlfriends to family gatherings, always white women, from what she called good families with proper backgrounds. There was Melissa, the banker's daughter who'd just moved back to town and needed friends. Then came Brittany, the pediatrician whose grandmother went to school with Eleanor's mother. Each was paraded before David with transparent intent, while it is expected to serve them drinks and smile. "David always did have a type before you," Eleanor would say loudly. "Blonde, educated, from families we've known forever." I watched David squirm uncomfortably during these setups, but he never directly confronted his mother, just whispered apologies to me when she wasn't looking. The Thanksgiving disaster marked a turning point in my awareness of how serious the situation had become. Eleanor insisted on hosting, then seated me at the far end of the table while placing David's college ex-girlfriend, Sarah, directly beside him. "Such a lovely surprise that Sarah could join us last minute," Eleanor announced, though the perfectly calligraphed place card with Sarah's name suggested nothing last minute about the arrangement. Throughout dinner, Eleanor encouraged Sarah to reminisce about her relationship with David, all while shooting triumphant glances my way. "Remember that Christmas at the ski lodge, Sarah? You two were so perfect together on the slopes." My food turned to ash in my mouth as David failed yet again to establish any meaningful boundary with his mother. Eleanor's criticism of my domestic abilities intensified in parallel with these matchmaking efforts. Nothing I did met her standards. My cooking was interesting, but not what David is used to. My housekeeping was casual rather than thorough, and my career ambitions were selfish. David needs a woman who puts family first, she'd say within his earshot. Someone who understands that a man's home should be his castle, not his wife's art project. The mail tampering began subtly. An opened credit card bill here, a suspiciously resealed letter there, until I caught Eleanor red-handed, steaming open an envelope addressed to me. Just checking for important family business, she explained without a hint of shame. David sometimes misses important details. During this confrontation, she let slip that she knew the house deed was solely in my name. A temporary oversight, I'm sure, she said with steel in her voice. No son of mine would allow his birthright to be controlled by his wife. The final escalation came with the late-night phone calls. Eleanor would call David at 11 p.m., midnight, sometimes 2 a.m., with manufactured emergencies that required lengthy conversations. After weeks of disrupted sleep, David started sleeping in the guest room, the one Eleanor had decorated. To take calls without disturbing you, he explained, but I wasn't fooled. The physical distance growing between us perfectly mirrored the emotional chasm Eleanor was systematically creating. I'd married a man who couldn't say no to his mother, and she knew it. What I didn't know yet was that I wasn't the first woman in David's life to face this impossible dynamic, nor how deeply rooted Eleanor's behavior was in the Maxwell family history. The truth about the Maxwell family dynamics began to surface when David's cousin Morgan came to town for a business conference. She suggested meeting for lunch without David or Eleanor, which immediately piqued my interest. Over salads at a gay cafe far from both our house and Eleanor's neighborhood, Morgan leaned forward and asked quietly, "How are you holding up with Eleanor?" "Really?" The genuine concern in her eyes broke something open in me, and suddenly I was telling her everything. The boundary violations, the racial microaggressions, David's inability to stand up to his mother. Morgan nodded grimly, unsurprised. "You're not the first, you know," she said, stirring her iced tea thoughtfully. David's father left when David was 12, not because he was pursuing other women like Eleanor always claimed, but because she made their marriage impossible. Uncle Robert told my dad that living with Eleanor was like being constantly evaluated for a position he'd already been hired for. Morgan went on to reveal that David had been engaged once before to a woman named Cassandra, whom Eleanor had deemed unsuitable because of her Italian heritage. According to family gossip, Eleanor had threatened to disown David, to cut him out of family inheritances, even to withdraw financial support for his education if he continued the relationship. Cassandra had been devastated when David broke things off without explanation. "Eleanor isolates David from anyone she disapproves of," Morgan explained. "It's why he has so few close friends, why he's distant from his father's side of the family. She creates a world where her approval is the only currency that matters." That night, I gently asked David about Cassandra. His face went pale. "Who told you about her?" he asked sharply. When I mentioned Morgan, he became agitated, pacing our kitchen. "My cousin shouldn't be sharing family business with you," he said. But then his shoulders slumped. "It was a long time ago. Mom thought we were too young, that's all." But his eyes wouldn't meet mine, and I knew there was more to the story than he was admitting. That conversation opened a floodgate. David began sharing childhood stories, seemingly relieved to finally speak about his upbringing, how Eleanor would give him the silent treatment for days if he disobeyed her, how she'd compare him unfavorably to cousins who were more beautiful, how she'd check his phone messages and emails well into his college years. "I knew it wasn't normal," he confessed one night, but she was all I had after Dad left. I couldn't risk losing her too. Concerned about the patterns I was seeing, I began researching narcissistic family dynamics and emotional enmeshment. The literature described Eleanor with uncomfortable precision, the need for control, the inability to view her son as a separate individual, the sabotage of his adult relationships. When I suggested therapy, both for David individually and for us as a couple, he initially rejected the idea outright. "We don't need strangers in our business," he said, echoing Eleanor's words so precisely it was chilling. The most revealing discovery came when we were cleaning out our attic, and I found a box of David's as childhood mementos, including a journal from when he was 13. With his permission, I read entries that broke my heart. "Mom says Dad left because I wasn't a good enough son. Mom cried all night because I wanted to go to Jason's birthday party instead of taking her to the movies. Mom says no one will ever love me like she does. That other people will always leave. Asterisk that." Journal painted a picture of a child trained to prioritize his mother as emotional needs above his own basic social development. On Morgan's recommendation, I reached out to David as his strange Aunt Patricia, his father's sister, who agreed to meet me for coffee. "Eleanor has always seen anyone who loves David as competition," Patricia explained. "Robert tried for years to shield David from her emotional manipulation, but in the divorce, Eleanor convinced the judge that Robert was unstable. The real tragedy is that David has internalized her worldview, that loving someone means controlling them, that boundaries are betrayals." I shared these insights with David during a rare weekend when Eleanor was visiting her sister out of state. He broke down in tears, caught between recognition of the truth and the lifetime of conditioning that made him defensive of his mother. "I feel trapped between two worlds," he admitted, clutching my hand so tightly it hurt. "When I'm with you, I can see how abnormal my relationship with Mom is. But when I'm with her, she makes everything you say sound manipulative and wrong. It's like I can't trust my own perceptions anymore." I tried again to suggest therapy, explaining how a professional could help him navigate these complex feelings and establish healthier boundaries. This time, he didn't immediately reject the idea, but neither did he embrace it. "Let me think about it," he said. "But please don't give up on me, Olivia. I do love you." Even when I'm not strong enough to show it right, I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that awareness could lead to change, that love could overcome decades of manipulation. What I didn't know was that the situation was about to escalate beyond anything I'd imagined, forcing all of us to show our true colors in ways none of us were prepared for. The 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test sent waves of conflicting emotions through me: joy, fear, uncertainty, hope. David and I hadn't been actively trying for a baby, but we hadn't been preventing it either, despite the growing tensions with Eleanor. When I showed David the test, his reaction was everything I could have wished for: pure, unadulterated happiness. He picked me up and spun me around our kitchen, peppering my face with kisses. "We're going to be parents," he kept saying, his eyes bright with tears. For that moment, at least, all the Eleanor drama faded into the background. But reality crashed back when David anxiously brought up telling his mother. "Maybe we should wait until after the first trimester," he suggested, his joy already tempered by apprehension. "Mom can be a bit intense about big news." I agreed to wait, partly for traditional reasons and partly to postpone the inevitable storm. However, at 8 weeks, morning sickness hit me hard, forcing me to work from home most days. Eleanor, with her penchant for unannounced visits, found me retching in our bathroom one Tuesday morning. "Food poisoning," I tried to explain weakly as she stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Or perhaps a more permanent condition," she replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "David and I had a little chat yesterday about family planning. He never mentioned you were already expecting." Her use of the word already carried unmistakable implications. By the time David came home that evening, Eleanor had fully processed the news. Her reaction was a masterclass in passive aggression. "Congratulations," she said, kissing her son's cheek while ignoring me completely. "I've always dreamed of being a grandmother, though I'd imagined different circumstances." Later, when David stepped out to grab takeout, I was too nauseous to cook. Another failure in Eleanor's eyes, she dropped her facade. "This changes nothing," she hissed, standing uncomfortably close to me in our kitchen. "A baby doesn't make you family, especially not the kind of baby you'll produce." I placed my hands protectively over my still flat stomach, stunned by the nakedness of her hostility. When I told David what she'd said, he insisted I must have misinterpreted her meaning. "Mom's been talking about grandchildren for years," he reasoned. "She's probably just processing the news." But Eleanor's actions spoke louder than any words. Her drop-ins increased dramatically, often coinciding with my worst bouts of morning sickness. She'd arrive with traditional family remedies, foul-smelling teas and tinctures that invariably made me sicker. These helped generations of Maxwell women, she'd insist when I politely declined, but perhaps your body is just different. The baby registry became another battleground. I'd spent hours researching safe, eco-friendly baby products, only to discover Eleanor had accessed our registry online and deleted most of my selections, replacing them with antique items that didn't meet current safety standards. "The family cradle has rocked Maxwell babies for 6 generations," she announced proudly. "No plastic Chinese bassinet could compare." When I reinstated my original choices, explaining modern safety guidelines about infant sleep, Eleanor launched a campaign of misinformation to the extended family. "Olivia doesn't want any Maxwell traditions for her baby," she told anyone who would listen. "She's concerned about the baby's health and appearance." The emphasis she placed on appearance made her subtext clear to everyone. As my pregnancy progressed and as my body changed, Eleanor's comments became even more pointed. "Maxwell women hardly show until the 7th month," she'd remark as I began to develop a visible bump. "But I suppose with your build, things are different." Or she'd bring old photos of David as a newborn, pointing out his perfect Maxwell features, with the implication that my genes might taint this purity. The breaking point came during my 4th month, when David walked in on a particularly heated exchange. Eleanor had been examining the nursery colors. I'd chosen soft greens and yellows, and declaring them inappropriate for a Maxwell heir. When I explained that we hadn't learned the baby's sex yet and wanted a gender-neutral space, she exploded. "This isn't about gender, Olivia. It's about tradition, heritage, respecting what came before you." "But you wouldn't understand that, would you?" "You're too busy ruining the bloodline my family has maintained for generations." David froze in the doorway, his face a mask of shock as he heard his mother's words. For once, there was no way to reinterpret her meaning. No way to pretend she'd been misunderstood. "Mom," he said quietly, "you need to apologize to Olivia right now." But Eleanor was beyond apologies. "I will not apologize for speaking the truth. This marriage was a mistake, and now you're compounding it with a child who will never truly be a Maxwell." She stormed out, leaving David stunned and me trembling with a mixture of rage and vindication. That night, my obstetrician called with concerns about my blood pressure readings from my appointment earlier that day. "Stress can be very dangerous during pregnancy," she warned. "Whatever's causing this elevation needs to be addressed immediately." David, who'd been silent since Eleanor's outburst, finally spoke when I hung up the phone. "This can't continue," he said, staring at his hands. "Something has to change." I thought naively that he meant he would finally establish firm boundaries with his mother. But as the days passed and he became increasingly withdrawn, spending more time at work and sleeping exclusively in the guest room, I realized he was crumbling under the pressure of being caught between his mother and his wife. Eleanor, meanwhile, had launched a new offensive. She was telling family members that I had trapped David with the pregnancy, that I was using the baby to secure my position in a family that would never truly accept me. David's inability to function normally, to eat, sleep, or engage with me about baby preparations made it clear that Eleanor was winning. The man I loved was disappearing before my eyes, retreating into himself rather than making the impossible choice his mother was demanding of him. I just didn't expect that choice to become explicit quite so soon, or in such a dramatic fashion. I was attempting to work from home on a Wednesday afternoon, trying to focus on a design project despite the persistent nausea that had become my constant companion, when I heard the distinctive sound of Eleanor's luxury SUV crunching up our gravel driveway. Through the front window, I watched in disbelief as she emerged from the driver's side, followed by a uniformed driver who began unloading multiple suitcases from the trunk. Not shopping bags, not a small overnight case, but full-size luggage, enough for an extended stay. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. Eleanor was making her move. I opened the door before she could use her key, forcing a neutral expression despite the panic rising in my chest. "Eleanor," I said calmly, "we weren't expecting you." She brushed past me with a cold smile. "David knows I'm coming. I've decided it's time I step in before things deteriorate any further. The guest room will do nicely." She gestured to the driver, who began carrying the luggage inside without waiting for my permission. I texted David immediately. "Your mother is here with suitcases, says she's moving in. Please call ASAP." His response was alarmingly delayed and painfully brief. "Be home for dinner. We'll talk then." The hours until David's return were excruciating. Eleanor made herself at home, rearranging items in her room, inspecting the contents of our refrigerator with disapproving clicks of her tongue, and making cryptic phone calls in which she assured someone that the situation is being handled. When David finally arrived, his face was ashen, his eyes red-rimmed as though he'd been crying. Eleanor immediately embraced him, whispering something in his ear that made him stiffen. Dinner was a surreal affair. I deordered takeout, unwilling to cook under Eleanor's critical gaze. And the three of us sat at our dining table, pushing food around our plates in uncomfortable silence. Finally, Eleanor set down her fork with deliberate precision. "David," she said, her voice unnaturally calm, "it's time to stop pretending this situation isn't working and you know it. It's her or me." The words hung in the air like poison gas. David stared at his plate, his hands trembling slightly. "Mom, please," he whispered. "Not now." Eleanor pressed on, relentless. "Yes, now. I've watched you suffer for months. This woman and her offspring are destroying everything our family has built for generations. The Maxwell legacy deserves better than to be diluted and disgraced." She reached for David's hand across the table. "Come home with me, David. Let this experiment end before it does any more damage." I waited for my husband to defend me, to tell his mother that I was his wife, carrying his child, and that she had no right to speak about us this way. But David remained silent, frozen in the impossible space between the two women in his life. I felt something break inside me. Not my heart, but perhaps my last illusion about our marriage. Without a word, I stood and walked calmly to our bedroom, closing the door softly behind me. Through the wall, I could hear Eleanor's voice rising and falling as she continued her campaign, with only occasional murmurs from David in response. That night, and for the next 3 nights, Eleanor occupied the guest room while David slept on the living room couch, avoiding both his mother and his wife. Our beautiful home had become a Cold War zone, with Eleanor claiming more territory each day, rearranging the kitchen to her liking, moving my books and personal items. to make space for her photographs and knickknacks, answering her home phone as though she owned the place. I retreated to our bedroom and my home office as much as possible, venturing out only when necessary and speaking to Eleanor only when direct questions made silence impossible. David seemed to be disappearing before my eyes, growing paler and more withdrawn as Eleanor's pressure tactics intensified. On the third evening, I overheard him on the phone with his friend Michael, his voice breaking as he confessed, "I don't know what to do, man. Mom says she'll never speak to me again if I choose Olivia, that I'll be betraying my entire heritage. But if I leave Olivia, especially now with the baby coming God, what kind of man does that make me?" I should have felt sympathy for his pain, but instead I felt a cold clarity settling over me. Eleanor had engineered this exact scenario, my husband seeing only two impossible choices, with no middle ground where boundaries could exist that respected everyone. Her strategy was working perfectly. She knew her son well enough to predict that, faced with an ultimatum, he would break rather than stand firm. On the fourth morning, I entered the kitchen to find Eleanor adding family photos to our refrigerator, old pictures of David as a child, pictures of Maxwell ancestors, but noticeably nothing that included me. "Good morning, Olivia," she said with manufactured cheer. "David and I were just discussing the future. He has something he wants to tell you at breakfast." The triumphant gleam in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about the decision my husband had reached. But what finally pushed me past my breaking point wasn't Eleanor's smug certainty. It was what I discovered later that morning. While looking for a particular maternity book, I found our family photo album hidden under the sofa. Opening it, I saw that Eleanor had been systematically altering it, removing photos of me alone, inserting old pictures of David with former girlfriends, and most disturbingly taking the ultrasound image of our baby that we detaped to one page and drawing a Maxwell family crest over it. It was such a blatant act of erasure, so deliberate in its cruelty, that something inside me finally snapped. I realized I had been fighting the wrong battle all along. I wasn't going to win by competing with Eleanor for David's loyalty. That was a game rigged from the start by decades of emotional manipulation. The only way forward was to stop playing entirely and reclaim my power to choose for myself. This wasn't about making David choose between us anymore. It was about me choosing myself and my child over a toxic dynamic that was harming us all. That night, long after David had retreated to the couch and Eleanor had smugly closed the guest room door, I lay awake in our bed. My hands rested on my growing stomach, where our child was beginning to make its presence known through tiny flutters and kicks. A strange calm had settled over me, replacing the frantic anxiety that had dominated my thoughts for months. In the quiet darkness, I finally saw with perfect clarity what I needed to do. First thing the next morning, I called my therapist, Dr. Winters, and secured an emergency appointment. "What I'm hearing," she said after I'd explained the situation, "is that you re-caught in a toxic triangle where your role has been defined as the competitor for David as love and loyalty. But you're recognizing that this competition itself is the problem, not the solution." She leaned forward, her eyes kind but firm. "Olivia, what would happen if you simply refused to compete? If you stepped outside the triangle entirely?" Her question resonated with something already forming in my mind. "Eleanor would no longer have an opponent," I said slowly, "and David would have to face the reality of his choices without being able to blame. The conflict on tension between his two favorite women." Dr. Winters nodded. "Exactly. This isn't about making him choose between you and his mother. It's about you choosing yourself and creating boundaries that protect your well-being and your child's." After leaving her office, I called my friend Jasmine, who happened to be a family law attorney. Over coffee at a cafe far from both my house and Eleanor's neighborhood, I laid out the facts about our property. "The deed is solely in my name," I explained. "We planned to add David after he cleared some debt, but with everything happening, we never got around to it. Jasmine confirmed what I'd suspected. Legally, the house is yours alone. Without his name on the deed, and with no documentation showing he contributed to the down payment, David has very limited claim to the property, she explained. But Olivia, are you sure you want to go this route? Property disputes can get ugly, especially with a baby on the way. I sipped my decaf tea, feeling strangely peaceful despite the circumstances. I'm not looking to punish David, I told her. I just need to know my options and rights before I make my next move. Next, I met with my obstetrician, Dr. Chun, who didn't mince words. After checking my blood pressure again, she warned, "This level of stress is dangerous for both you and the baby. I don't care how you do it, but you need to resolve this situation quickly, or I'll be considering bed rest and medication with medical urgency." Adding to my resolve, I spent the afternoon at the bank opening new accounts in my name only and transferring my personal savings from our joint account, leaving David's contributions untouched. I wasn't trying to hurt him financially, just ensuring my own security. The final piece fell into place when I gathered my closest friends for dinner at Tasha's apartment. Between tears and occasional unexpected laughter, I shared the full story and my emerging plan. I need a support system, I told them. People who will remind me of my worth when I start to doubt myself. People who will help me enforce boundaries when I feel myself weakening. Tasha, Monica, Jasmine, and Kendra formed a circle around me, their hands on my shoulders and arms. "We're here," Tasha promised. "Whatever you need. Whenever you need it." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd gone from being a desperate wife trying to prove my worth to my husband and his mother to a woman, reclaiming her dignity and preparing to create a healthy environment for her child with or without her husband's participation. The Eleanor who would be waiting at home no longer held power over me. She could say or do what, when I finally lay down to sleep, one hand resting protectively on my belly, I felt the baby move, as if in confirmation. We would be okay, this little one and I. We deserve peace and respect. And I was finally ready to demand both, without apology or compromise. The confrontation that had been brewing for months would come to a head tomorrow. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I was ready. The next morning dawned with an almost eerie sense of inevitability. I'd slept better than I had in weeks, fortified by my new resolve and the concrete steps I'd taken to secure my position. When I entered the kitchen, Eleanor was already there, immaculately dressed and despite the early hour. She was arranging breakfast pastries on one of my serving platters, pastries she obviously brought from her favorite bakery, as if our food wasn't good enough for whatever scene she had planned. "Good morning, Olivia," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "David will be down in a moment. We have something important to discuss with you." I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, calm and centered in a way that seemed to unnerve Eleanor slightly. She'd expected tears, pleading, or anger, not this composed woman who met her gaze steadily. David entered a few minutes later, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His hair was uncombed, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and he moved with the reluctant heaviness of a man approaching his own execution. "Sit down, dear," Eleanor instructed him, placing a possessive hand on his shoulder. "Tell Olivia what we discussed." David slumped into a chair, his eyes fixed on the table. He began, then faltered, shooting a desperate glance at his mother. Eleanor's smile tightened. "What David is trying to say," she interjected smoothly, "is that he's made his decision. Family comes first, as it should. He'll be coming home with me." She emphasized home as if the house I owned had never been David as real residence. I looked at my husband, waiting for him to speak for himself. After an excruciating silence, he managed to stammer, "I think maybe some time apart would be." "I don't know how to make this work anymore, Liv." Not a definitive statement, not a clear choice. Just the wounded confusion of a man who'd never learned to stand on his own. I set down my water glass carefully. I understand, I said quietly. In that moment, I truly did understand, not just David's weakness, but the entire dysfunctional system that had created it. Looking directly at him, not at Eleanor, I continued, I'll help you pack your things. The shock on both their faces was almost comical. They had expected resistance, tears, perhaps a scene that would reinforce their narrative of me as unstable and difficult. My calm acceptance threw their entire script into disarray. Eleanor recovered first, a triumphant smirk spreading across her face. Well, I'm glad you're being reasonable about this. David deserves a peaceful transition. I ignored her, still speaking only to David. You should know that I've consulted with an attorney. The house remains in my name alone, as you never signed the deed. Eleanor's smirk vanished. What are you talking about? This is my son's house. I turned to her, my voice level and firm. No, Eleanor, it isn't. The down payment came from my savings. The mortgage is in my name, and the deed lists me as the sole owner. These are legal facts, not matters of opinion. I retrieved a folder from my home office and placed it on the table. Here's a copy of the deed, along with correspondence from our attorney confirming my sole ownership. You're welcome to consult your own lawyer, but the situation is quite clear. David stared at the documents, reality finally penetrating his fog of confusion. But ... where am I supposed to go? He asked, his voice small and lost. Before I could answer, Eleanor jumped in. You'll come home with me, of course. Your old room is exactly as you left it. The panic that flashed across David, his face spoke volumes about how little he wanted that arrangement, despite having effectively chosen it. I spent the next hour methodically helping David pack his essential belongings. Eleanor hovered, alternating between artificial cheer about fresh starts and muttered comments about thieves and gold diggers. When she stepped out to make a phone call, David grabbed my arm desperately. Liv ... I don't know if this is what I want. I just need time to figure things out. I gently removed his hand. I understand, David, but I can't keep living in limbo while you decide. This isn't just about us anymore. I placed his hand briefly on my stomach. We need stability and peace, whatever form that takes. The car ride to Eleanor's house was possibly the most awkward 30 minutes of my life. Alana drove, keeping up a steady stream of forced brightness about how wonderful it would be to have her son home where he belongs. David sat silently in the passenger seat while I followed in my own car with the remainder of his packed belongings. I needed my own transportation back, and frankly, I wanted to witness for myself where David would be living. Eleanor's surprise when I pulled into her driveway behind them was evident. She did clearly expected to drive off with her prize without me seeing the end of the story. As we unloaded David's things, the full reality of his choice became apparent. Ella led us not to the guest suite I'd heard about, but to the basement recreation room, hastily converted with an old daybed and makeshift clothing rack, just temporarily. She assured David, though the insufficient preparation suggested she never intended him to have proper adult accommodations. Until we figure out our next steps about getting your house back. The horror dawning on David's face as he surveyed his new living quarters, the lack of privacy, the obvious demotion from husband to child, almost made me pity him. Almost. As I turned to leave, David followed me to my car. This isn't right, he whispered urgently. I didn't think it would be like this. Maybe I should just come back home with you now. For a moment, I was tempted. It would be so easy to rescue him, to take him away from the consequences of his own actions. But I knew that would only reset the cycle, teaching him nothing. You made your choice, David, I said gently but firmly. If you decide you want something different, you'll need to make that clear to both me and your mother. But it can't be because you don't like the basement. It has to be because you were ready to establish real boundaries and build a healthy family for our child. I touched his cheek briefly. I love you, but I love our baby and myself too. Think carefully about what you really want. Eleanor watched from the doorway, her expression stormy as I drove away alone. In my rearview mirror, I could see David standing in the driveway, looking lost between the house he'd chosen and the key wife driving away with his future. The choice had never really been between Eleanor and me. It had been between continuing a dysfunctional pattern or breaking free to create something healthier. David hadn't been strong enough to choose the harder path. But I was. The first week alone in our house, now truly my house, was a strange mixture of loneliness and liberation. The silence that greeted me each evening was both deafening in its emptiness and peaceful in its freedom from tension. No more walking on eggshells, no more intercepting Eleanor's unannounced visits. No more watching my husband shrink smaller under his mother's manipulation. Just me, my growing baby, and the space to breathe without judgment. I threw myself into transforming David's office into a nursery, a tangible symbol of moving forward, regardless of what happened with our marriage. I painted the walls the soft green I'd always wanted, assembled the crib I'd selected, and hung colorful artwork that celebrated diversity and strength. Each brushstroke and nail felt like an act of reclaiming my home and my future. On the third day after David moved to Eleanor's basement, the text began. The basement flooded last night, read the first one. Then, asterisk mom rearranged all my clothes and threw out my favorite sweatshirt. Later, she accidentally opened my mail from work. I responded with brief sympathy, but refused to be drawn into detailed conversations that might blur the boundaries. I de-established. When he asked if he could crash at the house for just one night, because Eleanor had planned a dinner party and wanted to use the basement, I gently but firmly declined. I think consistency is important right now, I wrote back, especially with the baby coming. Eleanor's attempts to contact me followed a predictable pattern of escalation. First came angry voicemails accusing me of stealing family property and manipulating David through pregnancy. When these produced no response, she switched to official-sounding emails threatening legal action, which my attorney friend Jasmine assured me had no merit. The final phase was perhaps the most surprising. Tearful messages about wanting to be part of her grandchild's life and healing the family for everyone. Saki. I saved them all, but answered none. My silence was not spite, but self-protection. Creating space for genuine change, if it was going to happen. An unexpected alliance formed during this period with David's cousins Morgan and Tyler, and eventually his aunt Patricia. They reached out individually at first, checking on my well-being, then began dropping by with meals, baby clothes, and much-needed company. Eleanor's behavior has divided this family for decades, Aunt Patricia told me over tea in my kitchen. Many of us have been waiting for someone to finally stand up to her. Through them, I heard about David's slow awakening. Apparently, living under Eleanor's roof as an adult was opening his eyes in ways years of marriage to me had not. The controlling behavior he always defended as mom being mom became impossible to ignore when directed at him 24 hours a day. The turning point came about 3 weeks after our separation. According to Morgan, who witnessed it, Eleanor had organized a family dinner and spent the evening referring to me as David, as temporary mistake while discussing how they would reclaim the Maxwell family home once his real family was established. David finally pushed beyond his breaking point. He stood up in the middle of the meal. Enough, he said quietly but firmly. Olivia is my wife, the mother of my child, and the woman I love. This ends now. He'd walked out. Spent the night at a hotel, and the next morning called a therapist, the number I'd given him months earlier. I learned this not from family gossip, but from David himself, who sent a lengthy email acknowledging His failure to establish boundaries and his determination to work on himself, regardless of whether I took him back. I don't expect forgiveness, he wrote, but I want you to know I'm finally doing the work I should have done years ago. He closed by asking if I would consider meeting with him and his therapist when and if you feel ready. I didn't respond immediately, letting his words settle within me and consulting with my own therapist about healthy next steps. Throughout this period, I continued focusing on my own growth and preparation for motherhood. I reconnected with design clients I'd neglected during the worst of the Ella Laner drama joined. A prenatal yoga class where I made friends with other expectant mothers and created a detailed birth plan with my doctor that emphasized my autonomy and well-being. The nursery was completed, a will and trust established for my child's security, and a support system of friends organized for after the birth. If David returned to our lives, it would be as an addition to an already complete picture, not as the missing piece without which we couldn't function. Ella Laner's attempts to contact me grew increasingly desperate as her control over David visibly weakened. She even appeared on my doorstep one rainy afternoon, oscillating between threats and pleading. I didn't invite her in, speaking to her calmly through the barely open door. I'm not keeping David from you, Eleanor, I told her. Your relationship with your son is between the two of you. But my home and my child will only welcome people who can show basic respect for boundaries and diversity. She left in tears, but the encounter strengthened rather than weakened my resolve. After 6 weeks of separation, daily therapy, and what appeared to be genuine work on his part, David asked if we could meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop where Dee had one of our first dates. He looked both better and worse than when he left. Thinner and more tired, but with clearer eyes and a straightness to his posture that hadn't been there before. I've rented an apartment, he said after our initial awkward greetings. I'm not going back to Mom's, regardless of what happens with us. He slid a key across the table. This is your copy, not because I expect anything, but because I want you to know you and the baby will always have a safe place if you need it. It was a small gesture, but significant. An acknowledgement of my autonomy and a step toward rebuilding trust. We talked for nearly 3 hours that day about everything and nothing. I didn't agree to reconciliation, but I did agree to co-parenting counseling to establish healthy patterns before our child arrived. It was a beginning, not an ending, a cautious step toward a future that might include David in some capacity, whether as husband or co-parent. What had started as a painful ultimatum had transformed into something unexpected, an opportunity for genuine growth and change for all of us. The path forward wasn't clear yet, but for the first time, it felt like we were creating it ourselves, not following Eleanor's poisonous script. Emma Grace Bennett Maxwell arrived at 2:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, weighing 7 pounds 3 oz, and announcing herself to the world with powerful lungs that suggested she de-inherited her mother as strength. David was present for the birth, having earned that privilege through months of consistent therapy, respectful boundaries, and genuine effort to rebuild trust. He wept when he held his daughter for the first time, whispering promises that he would protect her in ways he'd failed to protect me. Eleanor was explicitly banned from the hospital, a boundary David enforced himself with quiet, unwavering determination. She can meet Emma when she demonstrates she can respect our rules, he told his mother over the phone while I rested nearby. Not a moment before. Those rules were simple but non-negotiable. No unannounced visits, no racist comments or implications, no undermining of our parenting decisions, and no manipulation of any kind. In the early weeks of Emma's life, David proved himself a dedicated father despite living separately in his apartment 10 minutes away. We established a co-parenting schedule that gave him significant time with Emma while respecting my recovery and primary caregiver status. He arrived punctually for every shift, learned to change diapers and prepare bottles with methodical care. and never once suggested that Eleanor should be involved before we both agreed she was ready. During this period, David continued his intensive therapy, working through the complex web of manipulation and emotional abuse that had shaped his relationship with his mother. "I'm learning to recognize when I'm falling into old patterns," he explained during one of our co-parenting discussions. "When I feel that desperate need to please everyone at any cost, I can now step back and ask myself what healthy boundaries would look like instead." Eleanor's attempts to insert herself into Emma's life began predictably. Gifts sent to the house, messages through family members about her rights as a grandmother, even a consultation with a family law attorney about grandparent visitation. When these tactics failed, she switched to a campaign of victimhood within the extended family, positioning herself as the wrong grandmother cruelly separated from her only grandchild. To her evident shock, few family members took her side. Too many had experienced her manipulation firsthand to believe her narrative of innocent martyrdom. 3 months after Emma's birth, David and I decided it was time to attempt a carefully controlled meeting between Eleanor and her granddaughter. We met at a neutral restaurant with clear time, boundaries, and a pre-agreement that either of us could end the visit immediately if Eleanor crossed any lines. She arrived bearing expensive gifts and wearing a smile that almost concealed her nervousness. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said softly, looking at Emma sleeping in her carrier. "She has the Maxwell chin." I tensed, waiting for the inevitable follow-up about what features Emma might have unfortunately inherited from me, but it never came. Instead, Eleanor asked tentatively if she might hold the baby when she woke. "We'll see how the visit goes," I replied, neither promising nor refusing outright. David nodded beside me, his hand resting supportively on my shoulder. Over the following months, Eleanor's access to Emma increased gradually, always contingent on her continued respectful behavior. There were setbacks, comments about Emma's hair texture that earned a 2-week timeout, a boundary violation when she bought formula different from what we used, but also moments of apparent growth. Whether genuine or merely strategic, Eleanor seemed to be learning that access to her son and granddaughter now came with conditions she couldn't manipulate her way around. Meanwhile, David and I were slowly rebuilding our relationship on healthier foundations. He remained in his apartment for the first year of Emma's life, coming to the house for parenting time but returning to his own space afterward. We began dating again, awkward at first, but gradually rediscovering the connection that had brought us together initially. His continued growth in therapy, demonstrated through consistent boundary setting with Eleanor and genuine accountability for his past failures, allowed me to cautiously reopen my heart to the possibility of reconciliation. When Emma turned 1, we celebrated her birthday in our backyard with family and friends, including Eleanor, who had earned the right to attend through months of mostly appropriate behavior. As Emma smashed her cake with gleeful abandon, David took me aside, away from the celebrating guests. "I don't expect an answer today," he said quietly, "but I want you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to come home. Not as the man who couldn't choose, but as the husband and father I should have been from the beginning." I didn't answer immediately, needing time to ensure this step was right for all of us. 2 months later, after careful consideration and consultation with my therapist, I helped David move back into our home. Our home. With both our names now properly on the deed, it wasn't a fairy tale ending. We continued couples therapy, maintained clear boundaries with Eleanor, and regularly checked in about whether our reconciliation was healthy for everyone involved, especially Emma. There were difficult moments when old patterns threatened to resurface, but we now had tools and awareness to recognize and redirect them. As for Eleanor, she never completely transformed into the warm, accepting mother-in-law of fantasy. But necessity taught her what moral evolution could, and that respecting boundaries was the price of admission to her son and granddaughter's lives. In private moments, I sometimes marvel at the journey that brought us here. The ultimatum that was meant to destroy my marriage instead forced a reckoning that, painful as it was, created space for genuine healing. Standing up for myself wasn't about winning a competition with Eleanor, but about refusing to compete at all. About demanding the respect that should have been freely given. When young mothers at Emma's playgroup complain about difficult in-laws, I listen with genuine empathy, but also hard-earned wisdom. You can't control how others treat you, I tell them, but you can control what treatment you accept. Self-respect isn't selfish. It's the foundation everything else is built on. Emma is 3 now, a spirited little girl with her father's analytical mind and her mother's determination. She knows she's loved not just by her parents, but by a constellation of family and friends who model healthy relationships and boundaries. Whether she ever fully understands the story of her early months, the choices and challenges that shaped her family before she could remember, I don't know. But I do know that she's growing up in a home where love doesn't require sacrifice of dignity, where standing up for yourself is as important as compromise, and where even the most difficult relationships can transform when boundaries are clear and consistently maintained. Sometimes David still asks if I regret staying in the house alone that day, if I might have spared us all pain by finding a gentler solution. I always give him the same answer: the house was just a symbol. The real choice wasn't about property. It was about refusing to participate in a dynamic where I would always lose. By standing firm, I gave us all a chance to build something better. And we have not perfect, not without effort, but infinitely better than what came before. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between your own well-being and someone else's expectations? What boundaries have you established that others initially resisted but ultimately respected? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the most profound growth, and sharing those journeys helps us all feel less alone in our struggles. Thank you for listening to my story today. May you find the courage to honor your worth in every relationship and the wisdom to know when standing your ground is the most loving choice you can make for yourself and everyone around you.